Why hello there friends, it's Emma here, the Bookish Princess. Today we're going to be diving into and diagramming Jane Austen's Sense and Sensibility. Characters and character connections are so important in Jane Austen's novels, and it's easy to get confused and forget how everyone is connected. So we're going to be mapping it all out. I've done a couple of these before. We've done Pride and Prejudice and Emma. I am going to try to keep it spoiler-free, at least for the beginning, but eventually once we get deeper into the plot, I will warn you when we're going into spoiler territory. So let's get started. In the opening pages of Sense and Sensibility, we are introduced to Mr. Henry Dashwood and his family. He is married to Mrs. Dashwood, and they live with their family at Stanhill. Now, they have quite a nice house, but Mr. Henry Dashwood is going to inherit someday from his uncle an even larger house. His uncle has no children, so he invites his nephew, Henry Dashwood, to move in to his home, Norland Park. So Mr. Henry Dashwood and Mrs. Dashwood move in with their three daughters, Eleanor, Marianne, and Margaret. Eleanor and Marianne, of course, are our heroines in the story. Eleanor and Marianne's mother is actually Henry Dashwood's second wife. His first wife passed away some years before, but they had a son, John Dashwood. So John Dashwood is Eleanor, Marianne, and Margaret's half-brother. John Dashwood is married to a woman named Fanny. Her maiden name was Ferris. Fanny and John have a young son named Henry or Harry. Now John is going to inherit the Norland Park estate from his father, Mr. Henry Dashwood. John actually already has a fortune of his own from his mother, the first Mrs. Dashwood, but the second Mrs. Dashwood did not have much of a fortune of her own. So she and her daughters, Eleanor, Marianne, and Margaret, are really in trouble when their father, Henry Dashwood, passes away, which he does at the beginning of the book. Now, for a while, they do stay on at Norland Park, but it's very awkward because, of course, now it's not their house anymore. It's John and Fanny's house. Fanny's family, the Ferris family, is important in Sense and Sensibility. Her father has passed away, and her mother, we know, is a little bit of a Lady Catherine type, a little dictatorial. Fanny has two brothers, Edward Ferris, who she invites to stay at Norland, and the younger brother, Robert Ferris. Edward is very different from the rest of his family, and when he is staying at Norland, it's pretty clear that he falls in love with Eleanor. Fanny and Mrs. Ferris would like Edward to marry someone important, and Fanny, who is not a very pleasant kind of person, makes sure she lets her mother-in-law know. Now, Mrs. Dashwood has already been looking for a new home for herself and her daughters, and eventually she gets a letter from a cousin of hers named Sir John Middleton, and he lives at a place called Barton Park with his wife, Lady Middleton, and their family. Sir John offers his cousin a cottage on his estate, Barton Cottage, and Mrs. Dashwood and her daughters decide to make the move to Devonshire. Barton Cottage is quite small and quite a step down from Norland Park, so it takes a bit of an adjustment, but they do have quite friendly and outgoing neighbors at Barton Park. Sir John is always inviting them over to dinner. He does get on the nerves of the Dashwood sisters, especially Marianne, but he's always introducing them to his acquaintance. His good friend Colonel Brandon is staying at Barton Park, as is his mother-in-law, so Lady Middleton's mother, Mrs. Jennings. So we learn that Mrs. Jennings actually had two daughters, Lady Middleton, and her younger daughter is Charlotte. Charlotte is married to Mr. Palmer, so she is Mrs. Palmer, and they do make a visit to Barton Park. Last but certainly not least amongst the new neighbors of the Dashwoods is Mr. John Willoughby. He meets Marianne, quite a dramatic meeting. Marianne had twisted her ankle during a rainy walk, and Mr. Willoughby brings her back. He is actually in the area because he's visiting his aunt, Mrs. Smith. She owns an estate called Allenham, which Mr. Willoughby will inherit one day, but he does already have his own estate in Somersetshire called Combe Magna, and we learn that actually he doesn't live too far away from the Palmers. Their estate is called Cleveland. Sir John and Mrs. Jennings love to speculate about matches and future husbands, and they had been saying that Colonel Brandon looked like he had fallen for Marianne, but when Marianne meets Willoughby, they fall madly in love, spend all their time together. So we're almost ready to dive into the plot proper. There are just a couple more characters we haven't added here. I'm going to stick them up in the corner where there's room for them. Lucy Steele, I have to say, is one of Jane Austen's finest villains. She is a distant relative of Sir John and Mrs. Jennings, so she and her sister Anne are invited to stay at Barton Park. It turns out they know Edward Ferrars. They often stay with their uncle in Plymouth, and Edward actually studied with this same gentleman in Plymouth. All right, now we're really ready to dive into the novel. Spoiler warning, we're about to go full-on spoilers, full-on plot. So Lucy is very excited to meet Elinor when she comes to Devonshire, and it turns out she wants to tell Elinor a secret. Lucy has been secretly engaged to Edward Ferrars for the past 4 years. They met at her uncle's house in Plymouth. He was very young. He asked her to marry him, but of course, if his mother, Mrs. Ferrars, doesn't want him to marry Elinor, she's really not going to want him to marry Lucy Steele, who is even further down on the social ladder. Meanwhile, Marianne's love life is not running smoothly. Mr. Willoughby had to leave Devonshire quite suddenly, didn't really give her an explanation, so Marianne is desperate to get to London where she's hoping to see him again. Mrs. Jennings invites Elinor and Marianne to be her guests in London, so the whole scene of the novel moves to the metropolis. Colonel Brandon also had to leave Devonshire quite suddenly, but we meet him again in town. Colonel Brandon had a young ward, Miss Eliza Williams, and I would put Eliza's mother on the map too, but I've just run out of room. Eliza Williams is about Marianne's age, and she ran away with Willoughby, who got her pregnant and then abandoned her. So Colonel Brandon is really not a fan of Willoughby, and he and Willoughby actually fight a duel. This is like one of the only duels in Jane Austen, but neither of them are hurt. Willoughby, about this time, also announces that he's engaged to a rich woman, Miss Grey. Marianne is, of course, devastated to learn of this. One person things seem to be going well for at this moment is Lucy Steele, who's managed to get herself into the good graces of the Ferrars family. Fanny and Mrs. Ferrars, she's become a favorite of theirs, but her sister Anne one day lets the secret of their engagement slip, and obviously Fanny and Mrs. Ferrars' friendship with her ends then and there. There's a huge uproar. They cast her out of the house. They tell Edward they want him to break off the engagement, but Edward is quite an honorable man and refuses to do so. He did fall in love with Elinor, and Elinor fell in love with him, but she's really proud of him for sticking to his principles, even though she knows Lucy is kind of the worst, and probably they will not be happy together. This is a character map, so it's kind of just the broad outlines of the plot. I am skipping over so many of the beautiful nuances of the story, so definitely make sure you read Sense and Sensibility for yourself. Lucy's scheming ways actually set things right in the end because, of course, once Edward has lost his fortune, she is no longer interested in him. Mrs. Ferrars has now settled her fortune on her younger son, Robert Ferrars, so Lucy manages to get in with Robert Ferrars and manages to convince him to marry her. This leaves Edward free to propose to Elinor, and they get a happy ending. We learn that Willoughby really did fall in love with Marianne, but selfishness is kind of the beginning and end of his character, and he could not face the prospect of poverty. Mrs. Smith, whose estate he's supposed to inherit, had found out about his affair and threatened to cut him off, so that's why he went and married Miss Grey to get her fortune. Elinor and Marianne finally leave town to stay with the Palmers at Cleveland, and Marianne, knowing Combe Magna, Willoughby's estate, is not far away, goes out for many rainy walks and tries to imagine his house and ends up becoming very, very ill and almost dies. So when she recovers from her illness, she's had a lot of time to do some thinking, and she is ready to put Willoughby in her past. And Colonel Brandon, who has in fact been in love with Marianne for the beginning, eventually wins her over. They get married and move to Delaford. So that brings us to the end of our speed journey through Sense and Sensibility. I hope you guys enjoyed it. I hope it maybe clarified some of the relationships. If you're interested, you can check out my other Jane Austen character maps. We still have 3 other Austen novels that we have not yet diagrammed. I'm thinking I'll dive into Persuasion next, but make sure you're subscribed and stay tuned for that. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I hope you have a magical and a bookish day. Bye!